Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Please pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or via support links on our website, aroundtheempire.com. Dr. Neda Bolourchi joins us for a discussion of several major issues around Iran, involvement in Syria, the complicated alliance with Russia, and their decentralized power structure. We also focus on the Green Revolution, the MEK, and especially the misplaced expectations from some factions in the American foreign policy establishment that Iran's people, especially their minority communities, will bring about the regime change that their adversaries desire. To quote Dr. Bolourchi from a recent Atlantic Council article, quote, "Like previous American administrations, the Trump administration seeks regime change in Tehran. And like the current White House, but more fervently, the Washington establishment assumes Iranian minorities will join in what's being called, in certain circles, transformative change. Recent nationwide demonstrations in Iran over the state of the economy, Tehran's regional activities, corruption, and general disenchantment with the Islamic government are strengthening the Trump administration's hopes. But attempts to catalyze religious and ethnic minority protest as a means to transform the Islamic Republic have been a failed U.S. policy for almost as long as the theocracy has existed. This time will be no different. History demonstrates ethnic and religious minorities will neither spur nor lead regime change." Unquote. Dr. Bolourchi is an assistant professor at Rutgers University, New Brunswick's Center for Middle Eastern Studies. She is an interdisciplinary scholar who focuses on modern legal practices and the history of the Middle East, particularly Iran. She's deeply engaged in legal and archival and methodology as she continues a book project on the ideas of political theology, nationalism, war, and minority communities. She's also working on an oral history project, and she's completed years of research in Iran, Syria, and Armenia for her doctoral dissertation at Columbia University. This interview was recorded on January 18th, 2019. Welcome, Dr. Bolourchi. Thanks so much for coming on Around the Empire. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Joan. I appreciate being here.
Today, Dr. Bolourchi, today we're going to refer to two different pieces of work that you've had recent work in the past year. One of them is an article, and these, for our audience, these things will be linked in the show notes. You can find them for yourself there. One of them is an article for the Atlantic Council titled "Lessons from the Iran-Iraq War, Iranian Minorities Won't Lead Transformative Change." And the other is a talk that Dr. Bolourchi did for the International Institute for Strategic Studies titled "Iranian and Russian Involvement in Syria, Purposes and Prospects." And I found both of these to be really informative. And, we can talk about any subject that we want today, but we're sort of basing it on these two things, just so our audience knows where they can find these things. I guess maybe we should start with the talk, the Institute for Strategic Studies talk. And I found a lot of points in there that I found to be really informative and interesting. But I guess, first of all, I should have done this before I started, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Yes. Thanks, Joanne. So I am currently at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. I wrapped up my PhD in 2017 from Columbia University. I am, I think, as they say, a reformed lawyer. So I have some corporate background and consulting in the Middle East. I've done some writing a long time ago for places like James. So I have I am what you call very interdisciplinary.
Right. Are you sort of plugged into current events and information from locals in Iran because you know so much about this country?
I do. Part of both my legal work and then subsequently my sort of training and research for my dissertation and my forthcoming book, I do research in Iran.
Ah, so you do have a book coming. That's great.
I do.
Um, One of the things that people seem to be interested in that talk that you gave was the alliance between Russia and Iran, and
Mhm.
mostly centered on Syria. And I guess this is a question I always had too, was I think you said that Iran convinced Russia to intervene in Syria. Am I representing you correctly in that?
I did say that very explicitly, and I should have probably edited myself on that to say that that's the story.
Okay.
That's one that's not really talked about. So either people say Russia got involved, uh, or, in some circles still people will say that Iran convinced Russia to get involved through, I think, General Soleimani. That it
Yeah.
to the Iranian general, who is sort of this perennial boogeyman of sorts. I'm not sure how exactly he's alive or he goes from country to country so quickly, if not simultaneously, but that there was this story very much that he went to Russia on behalf of Iran's supreme leader and the Supreme Defense Council, and that he made sort of this pitch for the Russians to get involved. I mean, I think that that's not necessarily true.
Or not the whole story, maybe. Yeah.
Right. But so in that talk that I gave at IISS, I did very much go with if we are to believe that story, right? That if the Iranians did, in fact, do this, if they were the ones who sort of were the last ditch efforts to get the Russians involved, then the counterpoints and the reasoning I brought up after that would make sense.
And was there anything sort of, did they need to use leverage, or did they beg, or do you think there was any more nuance to that?
I don't think it was a hard, again, if we go with that storyline, I don't think it's a very hard pitch, um, because for all the sort of the reasons that we're seeing come to fruition, that it would provide like the greatest reach to, the Russians and particularly Putin, in terms of land expanse, right? That even the Soviets under the Soviet Union had not gotten as far, and they weren't under sort of Putin's leadership. And so if they actually got involved in Syria, helped save, in essence, Syria with the Iranians, and that they each use both their strategic and tactical strengths, right? That if the Iranians have, for all intents and purposes, a fantastic land game, right? I think one thing I didn't tell you is I was in Syria before the war broke out.
Oh,
The
uh-huh.
Iranians their land game is great, right? So they have been in Syria, obviously not to this number, but culturally there was a relationship, economically, largely religiously and culturally, again, because Syria supported Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. And it's a low cost effort prior to the breakout of the war. It's a low cost effort for the Islamic Republic to have some people kind of running around Syria, to keep an eye on things, to keep their ear to the ground. So and it's very different in that they're engrossed in the local environment, right? So what you would have is just basic things where Iranians learn the Syrian dialect of Arabic, that the Islamic Cultural Center in Damascus teaches Persian, but it goes Arabic to Persian. Like very sort of simple things that lets, one learn what's happening in country. And so the Iranians do this really well. And those postings are for a very long time. And the Russians obviously are much better at, and those are the reasons why you can get ground troops and militias, is because that's where the Iranians are stronger. The Russians have a strong, obviously much stronger, bigger military, but also they are not going to have, they have advanced jets, right?
Yeah.
That's their strength. So if we go with the line that, the Iranians are the ones who really pitched and convinced the Russians to get involved, each does what suits them well, right? So jets are much more expensive. The Russians have them. It also saves them ground forces and generally personnel. The Iranians, it's sort of a lower cost way to, one, get yourself entrenched. It's easier to be on the ground for them. And then also, they're not really using too much Iranians from Iran, right?
Yeah.
In their in their troop forces, those militias. So I don't think that, it's very hard to convince. You say the potential here is you're not going to have the loss of life. It might be expensive, but you're going to have such a fantastic reach. And this won't only be sort of a morale thing, but you have to think about how you're going to recoup costs and the potential off the Eastern Mediterranean, which might sort of, there's a new coalition of like the Israelis and the Greeks who are
Right.
into the gas.
Cyprus.
Yes. So that might be an issue, but for the most part, Syria has its gas. And then importantly, I think back to the strategic location that no one has really sort of answered, and it seems to be ignoring, is the potential for the Russians to be in a place of intimidation out of Tartus and Latakia, right, over NATO and the European countries, and how this might affect supplying them with gas. So I think overall, it's not a hard sell, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I agree.
time you get yourself in the middle of a conflict that has so many players that if you play the game well, you become, as the Russians have, as Putin has, sort of the kingmaker of sorts. Everybody starts talking to you. And if everybody's talking to you, well, I think then there's a greater potential for you to also make deals, right? So what the Russians get from the Israelis, what the Russians get from the Turks, what the Russians get from the Iranians, in addition to what the Russians get from the Syrians. And those are just the 4 major parties.
Right.
And
Yeah.
the diplomatic coup, in the sense that, you've sidelined Geneva and the United Nations again. So it's not just, and they go sort of hand in hand. Like if you're diplomatically at the forefront, it will create capitalistic adventures. So I don't think it's really a hard sell.
Right. Right. And the other thing that you mentioned toward the end of that talk was this sort of silent partner that no one talks about in this, which is China. And I mean, China's been pretty overt. I've seen an interview with Chinese media with Bashar al Assad where they talk about Chinese. He's clearly very interested in Chinese investment for reconstruction, and it was a very friendly interview. And the thing that you mention is, and I think this is a stark difference between sort of our reputation, the United States reputation in the Middle East, and now this Chinese Russian alliance that has formed. They at least say that stability is their goal. Business and, like you said, oil and gas development and so on. And so they are asserting themselves towards stability, whereas we have not delivered that lately, certainly in the last few decades. So, there is that Chinese influence that, again, hardly anyone ever talks about.
Yes, I think that everyone should, could, and possibly is studying how the Chinese are really doing business. Again, sort of as I pointed out in that talk, as the world's largest importer of natural resources, they don't want a war. So first and foremost for them is stabilization and peace in order to not break up the flow of those resources to feed their economy. Without those resources, that their economy its growth is gonna slow even more. And then also it's through I think really largely that their soft power and their how they maneuver, that people really don't sort of see the major loans that happen, and then eventually there's a default and the Chinese take over, as we've seen in a couple of the African nations recently. But Syria, there's going to be, there is and will be more competition than in a number of other countries, whether it's Transcaucasus or, in the African continent. But I think the Chinese have been watching and biding their time in Syria the last year or so. They have picked up sort of speed to take advantage of, the Iranian economy in the application of sanctions. The Russians also don't have the largest economy. I think part of that talk I mentioned that the U.S. could have been making a bid for Russia and trying to pull Russia away from China. That some of the funding and help that Russia probably gets for the work that it does comes from China. So I think that China does have an opening in Syria, clearly, but it's much more contentious than the other two larger locations.
Right. Getting back to the Russia-Iranian alliance,
mm-hmm.
I don't understand that alliance very well. Is there a way to sort of boil it down? I know there's a lot of history and all that, but is there a way to sort of summarize that for our audience and for me?
We'll take basically with the fall of the Soviet Union, everybody who was considered not an American ally, sort of became allies amongst themselves. So as Iran is coming off of the Iran-Iraq war, as Russia is dealing with the fallout of the Soviet Empire, they become friendly. And you can sort of see, as we're talking, all of those countries coalescing together, right? China, Russia, Iran, and sort of these former empires, how as nation states now, they're working together, each trying to preserve their own cut for their own country, but largely working together sort of as a counterweight to the United States.
Right.
And I'm not sure if that's short enough, but I would say it's a post-1989 relationship to counter the U.S.
Yeah, they're right in the mix of the former Soviet republics, the Kazakhstan and all of the Astan countries. Mm-hmm. And of course, they're very close proximity to Russia. So they must have a very long history. Has it generally been friendly or no?
This is
right.
This is a post 1979 and really post 1989 development. The Iranians have been hostile to the Russians dating back to the 19th century, if not before, because of the Tsarist Russian expansion attempt and actual wars that the Russian Empire and then the Qajar empires, they went to war. Iran lost territory in the 19th century to Russia. And then during the course of the 20th century, you see sort of the Soviets trying to take over northern Iran, what is considered Iranian Azerbaijan now, places like Tabriz and Rasht, large chunks of the Iranian north, particularly along the Caspian as well.
So they clearly wanted to incorporate them into the USSR.
Yes. Yeah. It's actually part of the immediate, I think it's Iran that is the first to file a complaint at the newly formed United Nations, and it was because the Soviets, so the Allied forces, I will tell you, in 1941 invaded Iran, and they occupied Iran for the entirety of World War II, the remainder of World War II. And part of that agreement amongst the forces was that they would then leave Iran at the cessation of the war. The Soviets don't leave. And so they stay until 1946, and Iran actually files a complaint, and there's a good amount of trickery over a potential oil concession that the Iranian government is actually able to get the Soviets out. And so there's always, a very large leftist sentiment in Iran. I have to say this. And there was always, during the course of the Pahlavi regime, discussion of another sort of Soviet occupation or annexation of territory. So which isn't to say that the Islamic government trusts the Russians now, but they have a long-standing relationship dating back, like I said, over 2 decades, in which they have come to work very well together.
Okay, so it's the last 2 decades.
Oh.
Yeah, and I remember when it was a very big deal because the Russians were sending, I think it was, sophisticated bombers, and they were using one of Iran's air bases.
Mm-hmm.
First there was talk that they were going to actually, have some kind of a presence there. And then, some members of the Iranian parliament were very vocal in opposition to that. And then it changed to, well, no, they're just refueling. They're just going to refuel there. And there was a pretty, I wouldn't say violent, but a pretty vehement response to that. So you could see that, you could see that sort of the shakiness of that alliance, or if you will, the limits to it, let's say.
Yes. It was very clearly somebody along the way decided that the Russians could. It was a mechanism for the Russians to be sort of a little safer in their operations in Syria. I think that they quickly realized not only that the populace had an issue with it, but Iranians who had been in the Iran-Iraq War and as well as part of the revolution, it triggered too many memories, I think, even if the individuals involved were not alive at the time of either World War II or before, that it was just a mistake. And so it was quickly rectified.
So that mistrust has, even though it's not in some people's living memory, probably most of Iranians' living memory, that mistrust has, persevered, that has stayed there.
Yes. And also the idea, so the base in question is Hamadan. And so there's a couple of reasons for it. If you look at the location of Hamadan, it's on sort of the eastern side of Iran, where you potentially have some minorities, in addition to this long historic strife between Iran and Russia, and then the occupation from World War II and the Russian or the Soviet refusal to leave. And so while the Russian Air Force was using the Hamadan Air Force Base for its jets and its long-range bombers, it is the first time that the Islamic Republic allows another country to do that. And it was a little also, in addition to all the other things I said, reminiscent of what the Shah had done in terms of allowing Americans into Iran.
Right.
So there was just too much conflicting history and really, I would say, kind of nationalist sentiment and sort of fear for subterfuge by the Russians.
So I think that's probably a good segue into your other article. Again, that is titled Lessons from the Iran-Iraq War, Iranian Minorities Won't Lead Transformative Change. And this is centered on, here in the States, we hear a lot of anti-Iran sentiment all the time. And basically, the conventional wisdom among the foreign policy establishment seems to be that, we're going to be able to do regime change there. There's, you have your more hawkish people like John Bolton, who would probably start bombing them tomorrow, or Dick Cheney. And then you have the rest of the establishment who seems to think that through soft power, more, color revolutions or regime change operations through NGOs or whatever, that the people in Iran are going to rise up and they're going to overthrow the current the current government, and they're just going to welcome us, and everything's going to change.
Yeah.
But yeah, but to me that seems to be an extremely, I don't know how delusional, I don't know how strong to put it, but you lay out, I just have sort of a sense from what I've heard from other people, and based, frankly, from our history, not too successful in these things. Well, I don't know. You could say we have been successful in those types of regime change in other places, but you lay out a nice factual case and a very sophisticated case for why that really is not a good policy. I'll leave it to you to try to, because I know that there's a lot of detail. People are going to need to read this to get all of the detail. But
Mm-hmm.
can you explain this to us?
Sure. So the Atlantic Council, just you are right, it is a lot of detail, and part of what I do is I'm a little sometimes too detailed. This Atlantic Council article comes from the end of what will become my is from an end chapter of my book, and it's even that article was a much condensed, both of them condensed version. But the idea that I'm basically putting forward is that the Iranian population over the course of the 20th century fought each other in different ways, verbally and physically, uh, for what I call their respective contending visions of the future Iran. And what that means is that they were utopianists. The Shah wanted a very liberal, not a very, he wanted a liberal imperial utopian society. Um, that some people say, oh, he was delusional when he said that Iranians could take care of other Iranians from the womb to the grave. And then on the other side of that, you had leftists who largely said the same thing. They said if we basically get rid of the Shah, there's so much money and resources in this country outside and potential that we can live in what would be basically the Great Society. And then the Khomeinists are also utopianists initially, and they say, their ideas, neither of these two is correct, but an Islamic Republic will be, in essence, the closest that we as a people can come to a utopian society that God approves of. And so these are sort of the political religious triangulation that I call it, and they're all fighting each other. And they break down into smaller groups, but they're verbally fighting each other for a very long time. And there are newspaper articles and speeches, and along the way, they all refer to Iran as sacred. And so, all religion, we understand the sacred is that for which you sacrifice. And you can sacrifice to a variety of degrees. But ultimately, Iranians, particularly those most politically engaged, started either killing other people, their political opponents, their religious opponents, or themselves. And the argument that I'm basically laying it out is that these decades and decades of discourse, newspapers, speeches, radios, cassettes, this actually starts infiltrating into just even people who are not participating, right? And so when the Iran-Iraq War comes around, the larger society as a whole, everyone now, as a result of nearly a century, is sort of prepped for this existential defense of Iran, right?
An external enemy now.
And so, yes, there's no longer the internal enemy or multiple internal enemies. They now have an external enemy who is threatening really all of Iran. And so, which, as I've sort of explained, is the sacred, as opposed to a sacred. And so they all mobilize. And so the article the Atlantic Council article basically I quickly, in that article, jumped to Iranians, all of them, because this language of Iran as sacred and the need to sacrifice, minorities are part of Iran. And minorities, I mean ethnic minorities, religious minorities, all type non-participants in this political battle are influenced by and have digested this language. And so they, in essence, very simply, are nationalists. So the war starts and they all organize and jump to it to defend Iran. And so you almost immediately have, the longer article that this comes from is in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. And, I just pull quotes from the Armenian Christians, the Assyrian Christians, the Zoroastrians, the Jews, and they release in the national newspapers, Jamhuri Islami, which is, very right-wing, Etzalat, which gets taken over as more moderate. They basically put out these statements saying, we are coming forward and we are ready. I can actually tell you, I can just read it to you. I think it's sort of the more to the point. The first statement that they release as a whole says, we congratulate the fighting heroic people of revolutionary Iran and assert the heartfelt willingness of Zoroastrian, Jewish, Christian, Armenian, and Assyrian communities to participate in the fight against imperialism and side by side with our brothers, here they mean Shia brothers, defend our land and beloved nation. That came out September 22nd, 1980. And so from there, the idea is, they had become nationalists for Iran over the previous decades. And they all, particularly those first 3 years, go to the war fronts and defend Iran. Particularly several times when I was in Iran last, at the War College, several people said that Iran would not have made it without the Armenians, that Iran would not have gotten past the first year to 18 months without the Armenians. And that's largely because Armenians formed sort of, they were the engineers and mechanics, largely. Mm-hmm. And so as their larger, or sort of this general occupation they had, they were much more knowledgeable and hands-on. So, yeah.
So the two sort of things that have gotten a lot of attention here in terms of instability in Iran and the possibility for, major revolutionary change are the Green Revolution. I'm not sure if that's exactly what they called that. Mm-hmm. I guess that was 2008 or 9.
Yes.
And then we hear a lot about the MEK, and we have a lot of American political figures and other sort of prominent people who every year go up on a stage and, do this sort of routine where, the MEK is going to, that's sort of like a leadership in waiting, a movement in waiting. But I find that to be very confusing.
Well, I'm just going to say on a legal point, I hope, since I'm not sure if you saw, but, I won't digress, but I hope somebody takes a look at all those speakers and if they are registered foreign agents. There is a law. They have to be, if you are speaking or lobbying on behalf of a foreign country or agent, you have to be registered in America as a foreign agent. I have not heard that there are investigations for people who appear at MEK rallies and sort of gatherings, that they are registered foreign agents, but as an American or an American company, you have to be registered. So I just kind of want to say that out at the top.
Mm-hmm.
Second, the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq, nobody in Iran supports them.
Right.
People outside of Iran, aside from potentially some in Europe, don't support them. So in what I talk about sort of in the larger article that the Atlantic Council piece is based on, I will talk about, there's a separate group called the Fedayeen Khalq. And so the Fedayeen Khalq are leftists, and they are actually the ones who started in Iran and sort of closer to the revolution, this idea of taking on the Pahlavi government, armed resistance. And the Mujahideen Khalq are the opposite side, and they are considered sort of this mix of Islamic Marxists, as opposed to the Fedayeen Khalq, which are just Marxists, atheists, basically. And so the Mujahideen Khalq, when the Iranian Revolution comes and it largely is seen that will be Islamicized by Khomeini, the majority of the Fedayeen initially go along and say, well, it's important to take on imperialism. We can kind of work with the Khomeinists. And you have to understand that prior, the Mujahideen Khalq was very popular. They were popular.
Oh.
They were.
What time frame are you talking about when they were popular?
Prior to 1980.
Okay.
So what happens is that there is Khomeini basically starts moving against the Mujahideen Khalq because they are actually, and his partisans, they are competition. They're political competition for the government. And so increasingly you see laws passed that prohibit sort of political parties, that largely will start going after what is the Mujahideen Khalq. And the Mujahideen Khalq don't end up taking it very well, and they are largely blamed for a bombing that happens, and that kills like 70 leaders of the Islamic Revolutionary Party and the politicians and clerics. And so after that, they are basically if the MEK was a person, they would be persona non grata.
Is this when they went into exile?
Yes. And so
and they went to Iraq, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And so this is, and it's and you know, the war has started, right? The war starts in 1980. This bombing happens in 1981. And so really this is because the war is an excuse that the Islamic Republic uses to eliminate sort of dissidents or political opposition or even political competition.
Mm-hmm.
And so after that bombing, the MEK, they are then, if they were sort of being ostracized and pushed out and arrested before, they are now being hunted by the Islamic Republic after that 1981 bombing. And so the MEK then goes over to Iraq and joins Saddam Hussein. And that really is kind of the end of any Iranian considering the MEK. Like once they, to the point of sort of nationalists, the strength of Iranian nationalism and what makes sense to them, as well as they also, no one wants to be sort of seen as supporting the MEK because that bombing in 1981 and then the subsequent support to Saddam Hussein and Iraq could have destroyed Iran. So it's not that Iranians, and I will say, hate the MEK because they support the Islamic Republic government. They hate the MEK because they betrayed Iran.
Right. They're traitors.
Right. So it's not because they had a fight with Tehran. It's because they were against what, you know, Iranians largely considered the more important fight, and that was the Iran-Iraq war. So when you see sort of politicians, American politicians out there supporting the MEK, it's very questionable. You know, there's been a lot of money spent on trying to rehabilitate the MEK. They have a very sort of cultish aura around them, as I say it. The American military has corroborated that in testimony and writing. Subsequently, I think starting as far back as 2006, people like Ray Tanner tried to or was paid to try and rehabilitate them, and no one's really buying it. So they spend a lot of money. Their money, where it comes from,
Yeah, that's the big question.
Right. I mean, it doesn't come cheap to run an office in DC or to have all these folks talk for you. So no one has really has been able to track down where exactly their money comes from. But for the most part, people believe it comes from, and I will say again, it's not known, but that their money comes from Saudi Arabia or Israel.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, those are the two top uh, potential suspects, I would think.
Yes. So that's sort of what the rumors say, and that it goes through various other countries and sort of fronts um, to make its way to DC, largely to DC, and then just outside of Paris in more recent years after the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. So yeah.
So
Uh,
the people who this support, this underlying support, is clearly a very influential force here in the United States. One, because of the people who go up and give these aren't just, calm, reasonable speeches. These are very zealous speeches. I think everybody, actually, I don't know if everybody has seen these things, but, you should look up, say, Rudy Giuliani and Howard Dean and a lot of others. Some who would surprise you.
FBI Director Louis Freeh.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
and the thing that makes it particularly interesting is that if if you see that, then you sort of understand this faction who has these ideas that will be able to overthrow Iran, and they, no matter how much evidence to the contrary there is, they never give up on that. It's a almost a religious thing, it seems to me, and but I did just want to bring that up.
Well,
The other thing that
if I can, I think that's why the Emmy, in addition to the fact that they get so much money to get promoted, I think that there is this notion that if we offer, i.e., if the US, if these countries who can do something about Tehran and replace the existing government there, if you just offer a different religious outlook or a different religious group, because of course Iranians are all religious, then, you know, then they'll go with it, right? That if you, instead of having, what is otherwise a hostile theocratic government to the United States, if you replace it with another
uh,
amicable religious group, then
that we like,
sure,
yeah,
right? The Iranians should like it because, of course, they're religious, all of them, everywhere. And at least the MEK will be thankful, and because the US and all these other countries put it into power. So that will be the end to hostility. I think this is sort of some of it, because otherwise, why wouldn't you, in essence, send all this kind of money to the Shah's former son, who does, right, pops up every once in a while, but because of, and it's really fascinating that no one puts him forward consistently as an alternative. One, why? Maybe because he's secular. Two, because of sort of the image of monarchy. These are other things, but the fact that you have a religious group who engaged in terrorism against Americans in the 70s, who receives money from questionable sources, but nevertheless is religious, it's not that the American government or American foreign policy is opposed to extreme religious groups. We can just look at the Taliban in the 90s, and we can continue until today. It's not that American foreign policy or the American government is per se opposed to religious groups. They just have to be amicable to the United States. And I think that somewhere along the way, somebody has decided that the MEK is a group now, supposedly, that will play nice with the United States and all the other governments. They say that they're democratic, that they themselves are Islamic, but they wouldn't force religion on anybody. And so their discourse, their language, it works for everybody.
right.
Is the idea.
Yeah, it's such an interesting subject. Now, just to go back a little bit again to the Green Revolution
Mhm.
that so many Americans were enthusiastic about. I mean, I just sort of in my nature, I tend to support movements like that if it seems like something that's going to be good for the people. I don't have any goal other than, hey, we want things. We're thinking of the Iranian people, the Syrian people, or whatever. I don't have any factional alliance, if you will.
Mhm.
Um, you know, but at the time I knew very little about it, and I wonder when you originally talked about the two different leftist factions, is that who we saw rising up on the streets, and is that the same, roughly the same group that is protesting now?
No, that's actually really so the for the from all intents and purposes, the Fedin Chalk, you may have a few left in Iran, part of the professional middle class, but for the most part, you will largely see them in Europe. And the Mujahideen Khalq, the ones that we were just talking about, also they have a few in Iran. I will say they do have a few, um, but again, largely in Europe. The Green movement actually comes from within the Iranian government itself. And it's vastly different than what we're seeing now. But in essence, there was sort of the short of it is that there was an election in 2009. It was the re-election campaign for then
Ahmadinejad,
yeah.
yeah.
And so what ends up happening is that there are allegations of election fraud, right? That there were too many votes.
Oh,
There
yeah.
were votes in certain cities and towns than there were even people. Forget about eligible voters. And the sort of the forerunner against Ahmadinejad was former Prime Minister Mir Hossein Mousavi, and he was prime minister during the Iran-Iraq War. He is vitally important, again, with sort of the religious and political minorities that I talk about in my work, in sort of pushing them towards the end to do more in terms of like money or organizing. So to be clear, in the 80s and early 90s, Mir Hossein Mousavi is not part of the left. He is very much a child of the revolution, as a proponent of the revolution, I should say, and an active, high-ranking member. So in 2009, he and sort of others basically say that the Islamic Republic has gone too far, that it has moved away from what it was intended to be, and he runs. And Mousavi runs. And so the initial election results come out saying, and very quickly, by the way, saying no, Ahmadinejad wins. And in turn, Mousavi does not actually accept this. And neither do, and I have to say, more his supporters. A lot of times when you see Iranian movements, it's actually the supporters who sort of get out in front of leaders. Like, for instance, the American embassy taking was not approved of by Khomeini, but those students, and he kind of has to go with it, right? So in the same instance in 2009, Mousavi, not necessarily meaning to spur a whole entire movement, but he's not sort of taking the election results, and his supporters basically go much farther than I think he really anticipated. Mousavi does claim a victory. His supporters claim a victory, and when the results are announced otherwise, it turns into a protest, and that protest, as you see, continues to grow until it became violent.
Right.
And the Iranian government, unlike, and I mean, it shows sort of the change, I guess, in the 9-10 years since, but the government then starts a crackdown. You see, Neda Soltani is shot in the head. Others are so much happens, arrested and tortured in jails, which was sort of a different story of what we saw happening in the end of 2017-18, in the sense that now President Rouhani of Iran doesn't really initially do anything. And the Iranian security forces initially don't do anything. They just sort of let the protests go. And then after, I think a month, then the government says, okay, enough is enough. And since early 2018, we've seen these consistently, but much smaller now, protests, riots, and strikes. So what's happening now? And so to your point of how is what's happening now related to the Green Movement,
right.
It's actually different in that the Green Movement was sort of a more elitist movement. One, it was from really participants, high-ranking members of the Iranian government during the 80s, participants in the Islamization of the Iranian Revolution, and very much part of the middle class and Tehran-based. What we see now is very different in that it's not really in Tehran so much, but it's in the periphery. So Ahvaz, Abadan, which are very much at the economic heart of Iran's oil industry, along the eastern towns and borders, a little, the west is kind of dying down and then will pop up again. And so this is now, and part of the reason the government has been a little, I think, reticent is because it is their base, right?
I see.
Khomeini very early said this revolution is not about watermelon. What he meant was it's not about food, it's not about money, it's ideology, right? This is an Islamic revolution, which I can, explain why I think that's wrong. But the fact that the government now is reticent to really take on these protesters, even though it has arrested, even though it has engaged in all sorts of acts, it's not what you're seeing from 2009. It's nothing like what you saw in the 80s. So, and that's because this is their base.
I see.
Socioeconomically, they're nowhere near middle class, which they're not elite. They don't have access. This is their bread and butter folks, right? And so bus drivers, teachers, again, the workers in the oil industry. So it does include, minority groups, but for the most part, it's not. And so that's why they've been a little hands off. And I think they're a little bit better educated in terms of how to deal with riots. Part of the problem in the Middle East has been training in terms of how to deal with riots, right? Like you don't take a gun. I don't really have the right analogy for it, but you don't take a gun to a street fight necessarily, or at least in the old days you did it, right? And so the idea is if you have 20 people who are protesting, you don't need to shoot them with an assault weapon.
Right.
If you control them, you let them have their protest, you engage in sort of behavior and talks that dissuade them from coming back, they'll eventually not come back.
And respond with some kind of action that alleviates, that responds to their legitimate gripe.
Right. Here, the government, because of sanctions, and not just the reimposition of sanctions, but even before that, there was, Iranians themselves will tell you they have a tendency to swing from having great expectations to being very depressed about those expectations not being fulfilled. Which is, I was in Iran for one of the elections, and a number of people told me this story about the characterization of Iranians. And so there was this great expectation about what would happen with the JCPOA, and that didn't come to fruition. And there was not the sort of alleviation, the economic alleviation that Iranians thought would come. And then, a year later, 2 years later, you had the reimposition of sanctions. And so the Iranian government has not been able to deal with this the way that it's wanted to, or it otherwise which isn't to say that they haven't made some concessions here or there or temporary ones, but Rouhani is not in the position, and his advisors wouldn't anyway just start handing out money, right? Under Ahmadinejad, the Ahmadinejad regime really went around handing out money. And that's how he got supporters. That's how he retained his supporters. And also sort of the characterization of how he talked, right? He did appeal to sort of the everyday man, not the northern Tehrani person, not the elitist from Tabriz.
So basically, killing the Iranian deal sort of killed their hope, their belief that there was going to be an improvement, that there was a path for improvement, which seemed as a very rational reaction, it seems to me. What is the solution? Or let's say, where do you see this going? We have Europe sort of pushing back against the withdrawal from JCPOA, which could sustain some hope for the everyday Iranian. But, I mean, how do you see this playing out?
I think it's going to continue. I mean, it's going to probably continue the way it has for 2 years, in the sense that the Europeans will still try to get the special vehicle off the ground. But they're going to also not only have to get a special vehicle for paying the Iranian government, but then they have to somehow induce their companies to then go do business, right? And so that is the hard part of this. Total had, a $5 billion deal with the Iranian government. They set up an office in DC to the tune of $1 million in order to work hand in hand with the State Department and the Treasury Department to make sure that they were not going to be in violation, that they would not be penalized by the American government. And they really made an effort prior to the U.S. pulling out the JCPOA, and they got a clear understanding that the U.S. government was not going to help them and would not give them any assurances. And so the Europeans have this problem too. It's not just devising a vehicle to pay Iran. You have to convince companies to do business with you.
To invest, yeah.
And Iran can the Iranian government can hobble along as it was for a while longer. Much longer.
Is this because the people see the problem as external?
Yes. Part of it is the economic side. Part of it is this is a unilateral retreat by the U.S. And then part of it is that the Iranians kind of don't see that they have a choice. So I'll sort of break that apart. One, the Iranian government can continue to, as I said, as a number of analysts will tell you, the word is to hobble along, because they are resource rich, right? So it's not just oil and gas, although those are 90% of things. And then the second part of that is the U.S. unilaterally withdrew. So this means that the Iranian government will be working with China, which we've already discussed is the world's largest importer of resources. So that will take care of a lot of things. But what sort of, and the reason Europe is making the effort is because Iran wants to work with Europe, but Iran really wanted to work with the U.S. Right? It's refined. You don't ever want to be in southern Iran. You don't want to be in Abadan and Bandar Abbas and places when you hear about Tehran environmental pollution. This is nothing compared to what's happening in the south. Oh. And so it's really those refineries need to be updated. And in Iran several years ago really wanted to work with the U.S. on those refineries. And they had a very clear idea that they didn't want the U.S. or U.S. producers, manufacturers, to just give them equipment and to train them. Iran has an indigenous, and they have, kind of going back to like I said, the scientific advancements, the Armenians who taught the larger population, places like Sharif Beheshti in Tehran, they have their own sort of top-notch indigenous cadre of largely men who have been able to keep Iran going. And so they, my understanding is, wanted to meld their platforms, their technological platforms, with providers from the US so that they could get new refineries, in essence. And that this would sort of help with not only producing more efficiently, but addressing some of the environmental concerns in the South and what it is to live there. And so, the U.S. pulling out kind of blows that all up, which, again, Europe is fine. It wasn't the first choice, but here we are. So to my point of China and Iran will work together. And it's because of China that Iran will largely make it through, hobble along, as we said. But all of those technological advancements, the billions and billions of dollars that kind of didn't really sell, I think, the American population or particularly politicians on the money that would come into the U.S. through a deal, that's sort of like the big ticket items for Iran. The extent to which Iran will do that with China, I'm not sure. I'm not sure they have a choice.
Or Russia. But I don't know if they have the same technology that they're seeking.
Right. And part of it is that, again, the Iranians are insistent that their own technology be part of whatever will be built.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but nevertheless, the majority of production will go to China and Japan. And that will hinge, the U.S. can't really do much against China and the Iranian relationship, as well as, but the extent to which it might be able to impose on Japan and India has to be seen. So far, Japan has been, hesitant, but Japan was, I think, the second or third largest importer of Iranian products behind China.
Yeah, I see.
So there are a few other, India has picked up more. So these are sort of the reasons. It's very important that this was a unilateral decision by the U.S. And so Iran will go elsewhere. But as we've seen, the U.S. has been squeezing sort of other countries in different ways. Some of it is via the financial institutions. Some of it is in other sort of our own packaging of deals, right? So what can the U.S. offer or take away is more appropriate from India, from Japan, from these other countries. And is it really enough to offset the amount that China is willing to pick up? And then I think we're on 3. The Iranians can continue as they are because they've done it before, right? Iran went through what they consider a war that was largely Iran against the world. And so if push comes to shove, they will do it. Are they tired of it? Absolutely. Do they want to do it? No. Will they? Probably. But the longer these protests go on without an influx from sort of the resource importing countries, the more it's difficult for Iran to get subsidized bread, sugar, and all these other products out into the market, which it does. And so it's Iran will kind of keep going for several years, if not a decade, as it is. And
does the population still largely see the alternative to be worse?
It does, because if you look all around, other countries are on fire. Yeah. And I say that because last time I was in Iran, somebody actually said that. They were like, why would we do, and right now, at minimum, we're safe, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we may not have economic security in the sense that people aren't eating meat. People may not have clearly enough bread on the table, but they are subsisting, right? And they are seeing very clearly from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and on, the alternatives. And then you have to remember you still do have
And that's the greatest threat that they that from Saudi Arabia's standpoint, right? Is the alternative that they are showing to be possible? Sorry to interrupt you.
no, not at all. I mean, the U.S. uh, has not succeeded in producing a stable country uh, anywhere, right, in the Middle East, in which it overtook a government, right?
Right.
And so all of those countries are examples, and anybody who thinks about it and isn't, right, the second you're outside of Iran, you don't actually have too much power. And then the problem that people are also not realizing is that the Islamic Republic is not centralized. This is not the Shah's government where you take out one man and it falls. And the response will likely be, well, the army was there, but the army had an internal fight. Okay, fine. But largely, the Shah had consolidated power to himself. It was largely since basically 1941, but really 1953 was his purpose. He succeeded in that. And when he decided to leave Iran, whether it was because of cancer and he wasn't thinking straight or not, it doesn't matter. He left. His army couldn't decide what to do. They fought amongst themselves. And so they crumbled. The Islamic Republic is not like that at all. Everyone sees the quote unquote supreme leader, Khamenei. So they say there's this one figure, and that, if he were to die, what would happen? That is a legitimate question. But there is a power base and a power structure that is decentralized, and probably most emblematic of the Guardian Council, where, you have dozens of members. And so where does power reside in Iran, right? And it's not, even though we will look at and label Khamenei, it's not per se in one person. If he dies tomorrow, will there be sort of a contestation over who becomes this new supreme leader? Absolutely. But if push comes to shove, they will. I mean, at minimum, you're looking at 100 people and at least a dozen institutions in Tehran and Qom that would be involved. So this is not, in that sense, like the Pahlavi state, where if you take out the centerpiece, it's largely done and over with. And so that is also part of this misunderstanding about regime change, right? Which is why people talk about like regime collapse, or as I labeled it, transformative change. But if you were to, it's just not really viable because of this decentralized power system.
Right. That's really interesting. I think I've probably kept you too long now, although I have 100 other questions for you. Maybe we can revisit those in the future. But is there anything that you'd like to wrap up with before we end?
Well, I think we talked about a lot of different things. And so I think I might just sort of say, going back to the Atlantic Peace article, the idea of transformative change or regime change in Iran remains unrealistic. Iran continues to have endemic systematic problems. I don't see that changing in the near to medium future, but that also doesn't make me think that there's going to be a significant political change either.
Right.
From minorities or otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've laid out a very strong case for that, and I appreciate that a lot. Where can people find your work? What's the best way to follow up on, following the work that you do?
I actually need to change my Rutgers page to post a few things. Right now, Googling me is the best, which is, you will get, the Atlantic Peace article, you will get the International Institute for Strategic Studies talk, and you may also find the Journal of the American Academy of Religion article as well. So I do apologize, my website profile page at Rutgers is not fully up to date, but Googling me is the best way.
Yeah, your name's kind of unique, so I didn't have too much trouble finding your work. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it so much. And, just thank you.
Not at all. My pleasure.
And that's our show. Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Dr. Neda Bolourchi. Find her work on her Rutgers University Center for Middle Eastern Studies webpage. The Around the Empire podcast is independent media. Your support is really important. Please pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or do one-time donations via PayPal, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. You can find these links on our website, aroundtheempire.com. The syndicated audio podcast has been the main focus for Around the Empire and where we have the most traffic. We're on most podcast apps like iTunes, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, pretty much all of them. So please subscribe to us there. If you like us, give us some stars for a good review. It helps with ranking and visibility. I'd like to do some improvements with new kinds of content this year, including some video content and live streams. For this, we'll need to hire some freelance creatives and also more subscribers on YouTube to build out that channel. Find the link for our YouTube channel in the show notes and hit the red subscribe button. It's free. It won't bother you with notifications unless you turn them on with the bell icon. Also, please use the thumbs up icon to like the individual videos. Follow us on Twitter at AroundTheEmpire.com. See you next time. Take care, everyone.